Hi, it's Luna. Welcome to day 17 of 31 Days of Horror 2024, as done in 2025. Do you like my new little microphone? I hope so, because I'll be using it today to talk to you about 2018's take on 1979 with the salacious slasher thriller romance extravaganza that is Knife Plus Heart, or in French,
Un couteau dans le cœur.
let's talk about it. Well, before we even get into the plot of this movie, I think that I would like to just clarify two things about it for context. First off, will be my use of the term queer for the community, which I know is difficult for some people, even if they themselves are not cisgender, not heterosexual. For me, I am drawn to it for its simplicity and its ability to embrace many identities under the non-cis het umbrella. So I appreciate your patience if this is something that doesn't vibe with you. The second thing to address is the setting, because I think it's very important to put it into the context that 1979 is, of course, pre-AIDS crisis. The AIDS crisis of the 1980s is something that I didn't live through, of course, but I think that it's very important to acknowledge the sheer number of lives lost, the terror that it put into many queer communities, that I think it's arguable to say queer communities never fully recovered from. And so I think that that's important background to have as part of this, because I like to keep my horror lighthearted sometimes. It's great that we've had actually the report of the seventh person who's been entirely cured of HIV just last year in 2024, when this series should have been. But it was a stem cell transplant, very tricky, very challenging, not something available to all, of course, but like we're getting closer and closer to maybe an end to AIDS entirely. So there's your positive takeaway from this video, if nothing else. Because it may be getting ahead of myself as well to say that maybe the setting of 1979 and its importance in this context, historically and politically, is that the director wanted to not have the weight of the story weighted by the effect of AIDS, or potentially it adds an allegorical twist on the killer in this slasher. And one last thing before we finally get to the plot. I'm using the term slasher to describe this film. However, I've seen a lot of people say that more accurately it's a giallo, which is a genre that has a lot of history, but I'm really not very familiar with. And I feel like if I can't give a brief definition of a word that I'm going to use, I maybe shouldn't use it. Maybe. I believe it's Letterboxd and IMDb, and probably a couple of other sites that will say that this movie is a mystery, romance, thriller, horror. These are the terms that get um, thrown around, I guess, to describe it. But yeah, I'll be calling it a slasher. It's probably more of a giallo. I just can't tell you what that is, so I won't. So, the plot. It's 1979, and porn filmmaker Anne has just entered a messy breakup with her ex-girlfriend and editor. And during this, she and her best friend and co-worker Archie are trying their best to produce their next film. But one by one, her actors are murdered, and she finds herself flung into an investigation to find out who the killer is and stop the murders. That's my bad back of the box summary, but whoa, this film is so much messier than that. Whew. I think another element of this film that drew me towards calling it a slasher is we've had the knife in the tripod and the ankh, and now we have the one to rule them all, the best slasher weapon a knife in a dildo. Nothing's topping this, nothing's bottoming it either. That's it. No more wacky weapons stored in wacky things. We've peaked. And potentially we should have expected this. I can't remember if I've mentioned it already, but this film is French. It's set in Paris, and I feel like if you've watched a few French films, it does come with expectations. There is a big old history backlog of French films that do not shy away from being graphic in terms of the sex mostly. Oh, what's that joke about Americans and how they're more scared of like a naked body than they are violence? But anyway, this film is actually almost a little bit conservative, I find, just in comparison to, like, I can't sit and watch this with my nan, but in comparison to other French films I've seen, not to then be that snob about it, I feel like it's maybe already too late as soon as we start discussing, oh, the French films I've seen. But for a French movie that has its main subject be porn, pretty much a lot of this movie is them just filming the porn scenes. It's a little bit like, yeah, I said conservative, but like it's definitely got like, I don't know, not that much of a focus on it in the same way that I've seen other French films do it is the main thing here. Maybe that makes this movie a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more friendly on a global scale. I don't know. I'm not familiar with the filmmaker's other work either, but we open the film in a club. Interestingly, it hasn't told us the year once we enter this. And I find it then very interesting as well when picking up on this that it doesn't tell us the year because it feels very, very modern. There's some kind of indicators as part of this scene of what era we're in because of the music. It feels very Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall, that 80s kind of industrial, bleak, that kind of music. Um, but yeah, interestingly, there's not much of an indicator in this club of time aside from presumably after the 60s. I don't know. I haven't seen any queer media that's explored any kind of queer scene in that era. Um, but yes, it's a club. They use a really like dark blue, rich lighting that I really like. It feels very bacchanalian, to use another little snooty term there, where there's lots of animal masks and some devil masks, and everyone there has like, even then kind of like some of the background characters that aren't focused on, like they all feel maybe a little bit nymphy. They have those kind of curly hair things going on. Curly hair things, I literally just mean curly hair. And it sounds weak. Definitely I will be adding pictures just to give a vibe to it. It's very Midsummer's Night's Dream, and we are drawn and focusing on this, it's quite like Twinkie boy. Um, but then we see as well that necessarily the camera isn't actually doing our point of view, but instead this other curly haired man who is almost blending into the wall behind him. He has very dark hair, a dark brown leather jacket, and a turtleneck as well. He's very covered up, and he stood in front of this brown brick wall by the exits. There's red light next to him as well. And I feel that this really brings out a kind of lividity, if that's a word. His eyes and his mouth are the only things that you can see through this kind of gimp mask. It's got a dull shine to it, and I think the atmosphere that this translates is very interesting because it's like I said, because of all the kind of set pieces that are animal masks and devil masks and music and hedonism, and in a club, like you presume there's alcohol, all of these things. I think that it brings like instantly to me a bit of a fairy tale vibe, which I think is important watching the movie going forward, that it has that surrealism to it. And in the club, I don't know what song is playing specifically. As I say, for the diegetic club music, it's God, my brain has blanked out. I'm such a fake goth because literally the only flipping band I can think of is Depeche Mode. Ah, and that's not a good example. But underground club music, um, and then when the man on the wall kind of like walks away up the stairs in a very kind of like luring way, and the young man dancing follows him. I like what they do with the lighting. The like dark blue is like his color. It's really beautiful and sultry. It is like going into like a very vivid nighttime scene for him. But for the man in the mask, it's very red and, you know, basic color symbolism here. But I think that they do a better job of not making it just so like. Sometimes I get the feeling watching these movies that are quite artsy fartsy that they're like overly pleased with themselves for basic color imagery. Um, but I do really like the use of blue here specifically. And how it becomes his color is we then have a tracking shot where we're moving through the corridor with the young man. And another aspect to the fairy tale vibes is that there is this kind of little raven looking bird, much smaller than a raven, but you're not here for ontology. And wait, ornithology? Yeah, you're really not here for that. So he's walking down this corridor. There's big, deep blue lighting, almost like a moonlit pathway, and a black bird like flies in front of him. But he's not startled by it. It still feels very like safe and dreamy. And then we have the non-diegetic sound enter with M83's soundtrack. I did not expect it to be M83. They had that one popular song that, well, many popular songs, but that one that everybody knows. You go, I don't think I know M83. Yeah, you do. You know that one song. I like the way that it enters into this very stripped back harp kind of luring. Like I said, it reminds me, if not Midsummer Night's Dream, then definitely that kind of Greek mythology, that sultry, kind of very homoerotic side of it, funnily enough. And whilst this harp music is playing, this soundtrack, I feel it's quite interesting in getting across the vibe of this love, this passion. And so it starts quite like sultry, like genuinely like quite seductive. They meet and the lighting is still very like deep blue, velvety. And then they have like a nice, like normal little snog. And then that's when kind of the more BDSM dynamic enters. He kind of like pushes him against the wall, turns him around, and then we have a cut to where it's then natural lighting, it's fluorescence, I guess, and it's still then didn't mention because as usual I am useless and out of order, much like this movie. Um, the out of order part, not useless. So there's then cut in between these scenes of them on the bed this old movie which is clearly then like someone's porn movie, and that's another part of it that's very summer vibes. It's got this feeling that's very soft and safe and summery. There's a guy in this porn movie who is pleasuring himself as he watches the two men getting intimate as well. I love this. I'm being so careful with my words because I know this is a video review that's public, and God forbid, but maybe Nan could watch it. I just don't know. This is when the non-diegetic soundtrack as well starts to get a lot more electric. I really like the way that the synth has a tension to it. Um, and so when he's been tied to the bed, belly down, suddenly there it is, our weapon of the hour. And so he pulls out this flippin' dildo, and like it's we don't see the threat immediately. He obviously doesn't have it out whilst it's in, you know. He pulls it out from his trousers. And then these cuts of this porn movie are kind of in beat with him being stabbed up the bum. These reviews are getting out of hand. The filter's gone back to red lighting, and that's when the murder is complete. And we see these red nails. Who could they belong to that was trimming this movie? And we get the title drop. So I wanted to be more in depth about that scene at the beginning there because it felt like a good one to be more in depth about. And I will be bringing it up later in regards to another scene and the way that I think this movie, to its credit, did a really good job of actually meshing that thing with a lot of slashers where, frequently right into like Psycho and beyond, the sexual subtext is there. Knife and Heart just makes it text. Um, but also has a more poisonous dynamic between other relationships. And this is the main one. When we have the title drop, we have then the little bit of text at the bottom to say Paris 1979. And there is a woman running along this big, long, I want to say it's like a car park. I'm not actually sure. Clearly, I've never been to a city ever. But she's running and she's clearly drunk. She's looking very like, I don't know, wine mom core, but like the morning after. And oh my god, it's Vanessa Paradis. I know that name from Top of the Pops. Taxi, Sasavi, rum and mambo, on Dias, il comme ça. Luckily, I don't think I have a French audience to wince at that, but it can't be any worse than Quebec. So there she is, gorgeous, compelling woman, but the way that they have done her costume and her hair and her makeup, she is a wreck. And clearly, she is very, very drunk, like absolutely flipping out of her mind. She finds a phone box and immediately calls up the woman who turns out to be the woman who was being cut in the scene of then the murder at the beginning. And we find out that it's her ex, her editor for her films, but she is so ex. They have already broken up, clearly multiple times by this time, that Vanessa Paradis, who is playing the main character Anne, has called her up and is still begging her to like come round. And her ex-lover Lois, she is saying like, it is over, please don't call me anymore. And so truly, we dive in at the deep end of this tumultuous love, this like toxic passion. We find out not too long after that the murder at the beginning of the film is one of her ex actors as well, her former star of her porn films, which don't do great. I have no idea what the porn industry was meant to be like in 1979 Paris, but she's definitely managed to get enough money together and enough of a lifestyle that this is her thing that she can dedicate herself to. However, there is talk about it maybe not going so great, like they are still under a lot of pressure as marginalized poor artists, but they have a great community because of the context of being pre-AIDS crisis. It does allow for these moments where the community is like very, very flirty, very light and sparkling and thriving, and just yeah, removed from the terror of post AIDS. And yeah, then she finds out that it's her former star actor who's been murdered. She goes to the funeral. Does she cry? Does she feel like scared? No. See, the thing about Anne is she's a scumlord. In a way, I love this for her. In a way, I love to see it. Um, I think that definitely it's one of those, I support women's rights, but I support women's wrongs. There's then this stereotype, I think, that comes with so many tropes of so many films before, where she's small, she's petite, she's blonde, she's our heroine of this slasher film. Is she like the final girl? She's going to go investigating. She's someone who, from these basic descriptors, you expect to go into the film thinking that you'll root for her. Immediately, I feel that there is no reason to root for her. Calling your ex when you're all like soggy from alcohol is one thing, but she does not care about this boy who's been murdered. Instead, she wants to capitalize on it because she's in a little bit of a rut with her filmmaking. She's like, what if I made a porn about his murder? And it's when this happens that I think the film starts to get like a little bit confusing with its cuts in an intentional way, not in a rubbish way that makes it difficult to understand. Some scenes are a little confusing at first, but I think that ultimately I would judge it as something that does feed into the psychosexual element of the movie. That sometimes you don't know what's real, sometimes you don't know what is the porn being filmed, what someone's fantasy or mindset being represented. After her movie Anal Fury 5, she wants to make Homicidal, of course, to honor her dead star, of course, and totally not because she's girl bossing too close to the sun. So, because of this, or then as she thinks, connected to this, she's finding that more and more of the cast and the crew are being murdered by the killer. To speed run, essentially, this is when the fairy tale elements kind of come into again, and the way that you maybe don't feel so grounded in this movie by the midpoint. It turns out the killer was then the victim of his father finds him and his boyfriend in a shed, and then when they're sleeping, sets the shed on fire and burns them both alive. The raven, right at the very beginning, that's not a raven because it's way too small. I can't remember what bird it is, man. Um, but it's very significant. It pops up a few times, usually kind of like to foretell an impending disaster slash murder. Uh, it brings him back to life, and this is something that's kind of explained to us at the end of the movie as well. And it turns out that he is targeting Anne and the people involved in her porn productions because one of her movies in particular reminds him of the way he was killed. And it is like the way the movie presents it, it's almost as if she filmed his death. Again, psychosexual. I suppose we're meant to interpret it by the end as he's remembering it and linking it to her film, and we are then watching it in a place where they do blend to as to be like indiscernible from each other, the way it is in his head. I suppose a big thing about this movie is then I think if I hadn't felt that it was on the more grounded end from the beginning, but honestly, more fool me. What was I playing at after the flippin' club and dildo knife scene, being like, oh yes, this will then probably stay quite like literal. No, God, silly me. This is all my fault. It really is part of what made the movie so compelling is that it was quite dreamy. I said that that soundtrack that M83 has got for this movie and the way that it does put you in mind of I don't know, nymphs finding the head of Orpheus. Like it's grisly, but it's poetic in a mythological kind of way with just all of this like flirtiness and like just just a big flippin' thriving queer culture. And I really like a lot of the use of colors as well, where as I say, I think that some filmmakers that I've seen lately will kind of it feels like they stick a filter on and call it a day for ooh, that's it, color symbolism sorted. But I think that a lot of the set design really lends itself to it. There's a part of Anne's investigations where she ends up in, I don't know what I'd call it, the kind of place where you would maybe watch a niche drag show or a burlesque show. So like a bar, but in a bit of a pub kind of way. Why can I not think of an appropriate term for this venue? In any case, it brings again this pantomime thespian performance with a lot of animals as part of the performances as well. Um, and just, it's really, as I say, compelling to then see all of these scenes, even if you're like me and you're sat there going like, what's this got to do with their murders? Like, is she gonna learn to not be a scumbag at any point during this? Because truly, the opening after the murder, where she's begging for her girlfriend to get back with her, That's almost like her whole thing throughout the rest of the movie when she's like, "Oh, I'm gonna make a movie that's gonna be so good because it's gonna be about my actor's murder and it's gonna like be so boundary breaking from its taboos." It's actually still, it feels, to get Lois back. And oh, this is why that's the scene I went into detail in, because it's mad how the killer, it feels slasher, it feels so like he's got a costume to it. He's got his mask, his unique killing weapon. But that in comparison feels clownish to the scenes when Anne is on her peak dirtbag with the way that she treats people around her, like professionally, like she is abusive sexually, professionally, and it's weirdly harrowing just comparatively. Like I sometimes the tone of the movie, it doesn't quite enter whiplash stages, but it really does feel like a bad trip. You know, there's actual murder happening and it's almost kind of funny, comedic. You're watching the way it's going down, like how very glib. In the meantime, the worst scene in the movie, and I don't mean like bad quality, I mean the one that made me cringe and curl up and want to cry a bit. So, when they've wrapped up Anal Fury 5, Anne is just such a nice producer that she always has a little picnic planned for them. Apparently, it's their tradition to when they're wrapping up a project, they got these nice, picnic blankets. We have this lovely scene in a big field with long grass and some evergreen trees nearby, and it's very probably what you'd expect of a 70s video that like, well, 70s America, the hippies, the drugs, the like flowing everything with the flowers. Um, and it's great. What a picnic. Someone's brought a bottle of vodka. There's no food, but someone brought a bottle of vodka. So, what a time. Anyway, I would genuinely go for this if I were a teenager, so I don't know what I'm complaining about. The Not Raven shows up again after one of her actors reads Anne's palm. So it's got that like mystical vibe to it again as well, touching on the supernatural, touching on like a more fairy realm. And behind her walks Lois, who looks like she has something to say to Anne that isn't just leave me alone. As I say, she is also an editor for these films, so it would make sense that she would like want to be there for a celebration with the rest of the cast for the wrapping up of one of their projects. But suddenly, the Not Raven lands on Louise's shoulder, and then after like she strikes it, it flies off, and a big wind whips up. All of this long grass is flying everywhere. It's such a dreamy moment. Like so much of this is just so dreamy. As I say, it's so like all of these scenes are so attractive to watch and compelling that like even when I didn't understand what was happening, I was still nodding along and feeling like, oof, what a feast for the eyeballs. Once this wind is whipped up, it's not raining yet, but this storm then does drag Anne and Lois under a tree, where Lois gives Anne like a one last kiss type thing. It is very melodramatic. Dare I say, in the French movie, it's very French. And we love the visual and um, relationship toxicity with just like all of this wind whipping everywhere and the way that Anne wants to kiss her back and she's like, oh, I could give you a lift. Oh, do you not want to stay? Do you not want to be with me in any way? And Louise is like, no, I'm seeing my friends. No, truly, Anne, we cannot be together. But because of the way that this plays out without music, it does still feel weirdly grounded as well. During the scramble to get away from the big winds and they're packing up the picnic blanket. Good thing there was no food, or they'd have to pack that up too. Thanks, Anne, for being such a Scrooge. One of the actors, the one who was reading Anne's palm, goes into the woods, and he's managed to get so lost from everyone. He's like calling out everyone's names, but he's alone in these trees, and we have this nauseating shot. This film really does use a lot of blue, red, and green, and in this it is just a flurry of green. There's just a 360 kind of camera spin. There's the actor, and then it kind of goes up slightly, and it's a big spin, and it feels like how I feel when I'm hungover in bed. So I really appreciate that. And it pauses every time because the killer's behind him, and it goes swing round, and then the killer's closer behind him, and it's swing round, the killer's closer behind him. And on the third time, because we love the rule of three, he stabs him. Can't believe the killer's killing. God, so basic of him. But interestingly, before we lead into the next scene, um, for this kill, the killer also gives him a long, lingering kiss. Truly, there is no death in this movie without sex involved. And that's what leads us into the thing I've been building up to, the most sickening scene of the movie. So, the storm is in full now. There's rain. It's dark. We've reached the evening. Anne's drink driving, and then Lois is out and about, trying to get a taxi. The way the scene cuts, again, it's something that if you're just reading this movie on a very surface level, I almost want to see that. I almost enjoy reviews where people have taken things so literally. They're like, why are they doing this? As if the whole movie isn't just one big old attempt at showing how an acid trip is. Um, but she can't call this taxi, and she's kind of like running from Anne, saying like, no, really, we can't be together. But now Anne is drunk again, and this has to be intentional. The way that she walks towards her, it's this big, wide Paris street. Rain is pouring down. The lights of the city are shining on the road, and she's screaming at her in her drunken way. And I've never heard such a mousy but frightening voice. And this thing that I think has to be intentional is the way that she holds her hand out to her side. It looks like a knife. She's got both her hands out in a way where it looks like she's walking towards her with a knife in a way. And oh man, she catches up to her. She grabs her by the throat, pushes her against this wall, begins groping her chest. She's wearing a mesh shirt where she hasn't got a bra underneath. The nipples are out, and she's grabbing her, even though she's telling her to stop. And she's just out of her mind, and she's saying all these things like, I've loved you 10 years, this kind of love, you can't cut it out, you can't push it down. But Lois is there begging her to stop, but she's molesting her, and she grabs her crotch under her skirt. And this is what I mean, it's really grounded. There's none of the background music, and it's harrowing. And at some point during this assault, there's a cut to a wide shot from far away of the face of the killer in his mask, watching as all of this goes down. And I think surely this is meant to be one of the imagined things that happens, because at some point during this assault, Anne then turns around, like she can sense that he's there. But there's no flipping way that she would hear him. There's no way that she would sense that he was there. But it's during this that then she's obviously distracted enough that Lois manages to run away. But we don't see Lois run away. Like we don't follow her. We just keep the camera on Anne and her being like, "Oh my god, I'm the worst." Oh, French crying. Um, and I think that there are a lot of clever things in this movie and the way that it's filmed that link Anne and the killer in this way that I really enjoy. It's just, I don't know. It's one that you've really got to get on board with some of the ideas going on early on. It feels like tonal whiplash every now and then because the killer is so almost Scooby Doo comparatively. The way that it cuts in these scenes, I don't know. I feel I don't have suggestions for what I think could have worked better for me. I just know that for me, it kind of almost didn't really work. These are the two scenes I thought that I would focus on for this video because once again, I can only apologize that I am just a depressed little freak and took so long to make these videos because it's been a fair while since I watched it, um, and I feel quite quite lukewarm on it as a whole, which I feel really really sad about. I feel like a queer traitor that this is one of those scenarios where I do feel like a lot of movies I would watch them if they just made the same but made it queer. And I feel that way with this one. Slasher is not then one of my favorite horror genres. It's so nebulous to say I like horror sometimes. And for me, like slashers, they're not one of my go tos. And yeah, like I would still recommend this movie. It's just difficult to then kind of say why past really loving the cinematography and just finding it such a nice, like engaging palette to work with. And yeah, yeah, it's been a difficult one to talk about because of that, I think. And before it turns out I've actually been rambling for ages and ages and haven't noticed. Classic. But I think at the end of all this, I am going to say that Knife Plus Heart is a solid 2.5 white eyed crows for me. As always, you'd better not be thinking of 2.5 as a bad review. It's good. It's perfectly mid. Um, I feel terrible because really I think it deserves more. I just, for my personal enjoyment, I can't give it that, but would highly recommend because it's definitely not like anything you've ever seen in some ways. And yeah, I would like if more people saw it so that I could maybe then appreciate it more from other people's perspectives who are just more slasher enjoyers, I think. If you enjoyed this ramble and it's introduced you to a movie that you're like, maybe I would like to have opinions on this, fantastic! Please peruse my entire playlist of 31 Days of Horror if you feel like it. Hope you'll join me for the next one, where in every generation a slayer is born. Fuck, I'm getting my coffee. Come here.